The glass tubes of 80 cathode ray monitors warmed up with a dull, static pop, casting a pale, greenish wash over the concrete walls of the basement surveillance bunker. I adjusted my headset. The foam padding deteriorated down to the brittle plastic, digging into my temple as I scanned the tiled grid of screens. It was 00. The evening lockdown protocol had just been completed. Upstairs, behind the heavy iron security grills of the Northridge Galleria, 300 people were trying to sleep. During the daylight hours, we practiced a desperate, fragile pantomime of the old world. The food court stalls had been converted into distribution nodes, where families traded scavenged brass casings and dry batteries for small tins of meat. The children spent their afternoons running through the unpowered cabinets of the Time-Out arcade, tossing plastic tokens at dead monitors, their laughter echoing off the massive glass skylights. We had shops, we had currency, we had a governing council that sat in the old department store business office. We had constructed a city inside a corporate fortress, and for 2 months, we had convinced ourselves it was enough to stave off the rot outside the glass. But the architecture changed once the sun dropped behind the highway embankment. I reached for my logbook, a water-stained ledger salvaged from a Sears hardware office. Next to it lay a discarded military tactical manual, its cover torn, bearing the title The Cold Frontier Survival in the Great Freeze. It was a useless relic from a different crisis, left behind by some long-dead guard, but its weight served to hold down the curling edges of my tracking sheets. Monitor 14, which covered the secondary service corridor behind the third-tier apparel wing, flicked with a sudden vertical line of static interference. I leaned closer to the glass screen, the electrical smell of heated dust rising from the chassis. The corridor was supposed to be completely vacant. The reinforced fire doors at either end were held shut with industrial padlocks, the keys hanging from a ring on my belt. Yet, on the low-resolution gray feed, something had altered the geometry of the hallway. The display mannequins from the vacant bridal boutique had been moved. 3 days ago, they had been locked inside the showroom, their fiberglass limbs arranged in rigid, smiling poses behind the safety glass. Now, 2 of them stood in the center of the concrete corridor, 20 yards from the shop entrance. They were positioned facing each other, their armless torsos tilted forward at an angle that should have dropped them onto the linoleum. I didn't blink. Dee didn't reach for the radio right away. After weeks in the basement on 4 hours of sleep a night, your eyes play tricks. The contrast settings on these old systems are poor, turning every shifting line of soot into a shape. Then, the indicator lamp for elevator car 3 began to flash. The mechanical selector switches behind my desk clicked in sequence, a dry, rhythmic sound that resembled a clock running out of weights. The master routing panel showed elevator car 3 was climbing. The Galleria had 3 levels open to the public: the ground floor concourse, the second-tier retail terrace, and the upper food court mezzanine. The elevator system had been locked down at the main breaker since the second week of the collapse to preserve our diesel generator reserves. There was no current flowing to the lift motors. The indicator light moved past the first tier. It stepped past the second. It paused at the third. Then, the small amber lamp stepped upward once more, illuminating a blank metal socket where no light was supposed to exist. A 4th floor. The Galleria didn't have a 4th level. The roof structure sat directly above the third-tier girders, separated only by the structural iron support frames of the cooling towers. The speaker on the main console rattled with a dry, unpowered hiss. It wasn't the shortwave radio or the security team's walkie-talkies. It was the internal intercom system for elevator car 3, a network of copper wires that had been severed when the maintenance shaft flooded in May Harlan. The speaker muttered. The voice was thin, devoid of the respiratory friction of a living chest. It carried the precise, rhythmic intonation of my brother, who had been left behind in the industrial district during the first week of the mass migration. "Harlan, the gate is open," the voice said through the fabric mesh. "The car is steady. We are waiting on the lower platform, Harlan. Bring the ledger. Your father has his boots on." He stood up, my chair legs scraping a sharp line across the concrete floorboards. My fingers went down to the iron handle of my flashlight, my skin cold against the metal casing. I didn't answer the speaker. Dee took a piece of heavy utility tape from the workspace drawer and slapped it across the intercom grill, deadening the cadence until it was nothing but a low-frequency vibration that set an ache inside my jawbone. The hallucinations were a known transactional cost of the insomnia. The medical logs, kept by the clinic in the old shoe boutique, noted it as structural auditory projection. When the brain is deprived of slow-wave sleep within an enclosed corporate perimeter, it translates the ambient noise of the building, the groan of the cooling vents, the expansion of the tin roof sheets into familiar dialects. I switched monitor 42 to the third-tier Western concourse. Marcus, the perimeter watchman for the midnight shift, was pacing his rote outside the department store entrance. He carried a heavy iron pry bar across his forearms, his canvas coat dark with grease along the seams. He looked intact on the screen, his stride measured and certain. I watched his silhouette pass a row of darkened storefronts. He stopped, his head tilted toward the ceiling, as if he had detected a leak in the structural glass. On the monitor, Marcus didn't unholster his weapon. He slowly lowered the iron pry bar until the tip rested against the terrazzo tile floor. His torso remained perfectly motionless for 3 minutes, while the gray static of the camera loop ran down the margins of the screen. D reached for the microphone of the primary security band. Marcus, this is Brooks in the bunker. Report your status. You've stopped outside the jewelry store. The radio stayed silent. On monitor 42, I could see the small indicator light on his shoulder unit chattering, blinking green to show the link was open. But no audio came back down the line. He wasn't pressing the transmit button. Instead, he began to unlatch the padlocks on the heavy iron security grill behind him. The store was a vacant luggage outlet, its interior completely dark, the rear service entrance leading into an unlit maze of maintenance corridors that connected the mall's utility grid to the old shipping docks. We had sealed that wing 40 days ago, after the ventilation shafts began to return a scent of stagnant water. Marcus didn't use his flashlight. He pushed the iron grill open by inches, the metal tracks releasing a dry shriek that I could hear even through the concrete floorboards beneath my feet. D stepped over the threshold into the gloom of the shop, his canvas coat disappearing into the non-reflective dark of the interior wall. Marcus, halt your advance, I said, my voice dropping into a flat, defensive registry as I leaned into the desk console. You are entering a closed sector. Turn back to the concourse. He didn't turn. A second later, the camera on monitor 44, which covered the internal inventory room of the luggage store, picked him up. The infrared illumination from the camera lens caught his face. His eyes were wide open, the pupils entirely dilated until the iris was nothing but a thin ring of xeric gray. Was looking straight up at the ceiling tile, his mouth unhinged so far that the skin at the corners of his lips had split into small, pale triangles. He wasn't breathing. His chest didn't rise beneath his canvas jacket, but his tongue was moving against his teeth, shaping words that carried no air behind them. From the speaker behind the utility tape on my desk, the unpowered hiss rose in volume, translating his micro-movements into an unmistakable flat projection. The lane is clear, Harlan, Marcus's mouth was saying on the screen. The children are already in the cars. The rain has stopped outside the plaza. Come down before the gates are locked. D walked straight into the rear masonry shaft, where the old freight elevator hoist sat dead. He didn't look down. He stepped into the empty opening, his frame dropping out of the camera's field of view without a sound, leaving nothing but the empty loop of gray static on the monitor screen. By 2:30, the primary generator in the annex began to miss its strokes. The voltage across the Northridge grid dropped from 200 down to 70 within seconds, the green monitors in the bunker shrinking to tiny, violet points of light before fading entirely into dark glass. The silence that settled over the basement was absolute. The regular drone of the ventilation fans died, leaving the air heavy and cold, smelling of old concrete dust and sulfur grease. D stood in the center of the dark room, my inspection lamp casting a narrow, crimson arc across the piles of tracking sheets. My heart was hitting my ribs with a heavy, irregular momentum. I wasn't alone down here. The high frequency ringing in my ears had changed tone, shifting into a multi-vocal chant that seemed to rise from the drainage sumps beneath the foundation. Hauled my weight up the iron stairs of the escape hatch, my work boots skidding on the cold rungs until I reached the main floor behind the food court. The concourse was flooded with a pale, lime-colored twilight from the storm outside the glass dome. The 300 survivors were no longer in their makeshift camps. They weren't huddled beneath their wool blankets inside the storefronts. They were standing in the avenues of the mall, Men, women, and the small children from the arcade, all of them stood perfectly upright on the terrazzo tiles, their heels pinned together, their arms extended straight down at their sides with the palms turned outward. Their eyes were shut tight, their faces turned toward the massive central skylight where the low, charcoal clouds were pressing against the iron support frames. They did not speak, they did not breathe, but their jaws were moving in unison, a massive, synchronized clicking of thousands of teeth striking each other like dry stone blocks, clack, clack, clack. DA backed away toward the security office, my hand locking onto the iron grip of my utility tool. "Sarah," I muttered, looking for the council leader's daughter among the rings of figures near the fountain. "Sarah, get down." A figure at the front of the circle turned its head. The movement was entirely mechanical, a sharp 60-degree rotation of the neck vertebrae that made the fabric of her nightgown creak in the quiet. She didn't open her eyes. Her lids remained sealed with a dense layer of road grime, but her throat opened, projecting a clear, flat cadence that filled the entire 3 tiers of the Galleria. "The inventory is verified," Harlan, her chest produced, the tone identical to my deceased brother's voice from the radio. "The third operator has taken his station. Why are you still holding the manifest?" Then, from every unpowered loudspeaker along the concourse, from every dead telephone receiver in the storefronts, and from the mouth of every closed-eyed child standing in the light of the storm, a single sound rose. It was my name, called out by 300 voices at the exact same fraction of a second flat, a motionless demand that shook the glass sheets of the skylight until the first fracture line opened across the center of the dome. The structural iron supporting the central skylight did not snap with a sharp report, it tore, the thick metal groaning as the glass dome fractured along its central seam. A fine, gray soot began to sift down through the opening, dusting the heads of the 300 people standing below in the concourse. They did not shift their weight. Their boots remained pinned to the terrazzo tiles, their palms turned outward, their unbreathing chests catching the falling debris. The sound of their teeth clicking, clack, 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 did not lessen. It multiplied within the hollow architecture of the tiers, bouncing off the storefront gates until the entire 3-story concourse became an unpowered amplifier. The frequency rattled the loose plastic trim on the structural pillars, vibrating up through the soles of my shoes with a low, leaden momentum. I backed away into the service entry behind the gyro stand, my shoulder hitting a stack of empty plastic crates. The air was getting progressively thinner, leaving an oily taste of dry plaster and machine grease at the back of my throat. My 96 hours of sleep deprivation had left my vision loose at the edges, turning the text on the exit signs into shifting, gray lines. I had to reach the maintenance tunnels beneath the anchor stores. If the crowd on the concourse turned their collective focus toward the service wing, there wouldn't be enough room in the corridors to slide the iron deadbolts. "Harlan." The voice didn't emerge from the crowd. It came from an unpowered payphone mounted to the tile wall beside the employee lockers. The handset was resting in its cradle, yet the small metal chrome plate around the dial was vibrating with that same flat, airless projection. "The ledger is incomplete, Harlan," my brother's voice said from the iron casing. "The delivery at the rear platform hasn't been logged. Your father is cold out in the lot. Bring the keys down to the lower tier." I reached out with my utility tool, using the iron shaft to strike the plastic handset, knocking it from the cradle until it swung by its armored steel cord, the voice dissolving into a wet, low-frequency hum that matched the structural drone of the building. By 3 in the morning, the service corridor behind the major department store had turned into a freezing stone vault. Without the auxiliary generator, the subterranean mains were dark, broken only by the narrow, crimson arc of my battery-operated inspection lamp. Every 10 feet, the pipe joints would contract against the masonry with a dry click, and my hand would freeze on the grip of my tool, my Mangenhai translating the thermal shrinkage into the sound of a leather shoe stepping onto the concrete behind me. The survival guide under my arm felt like an ironic weight. The corporate infrastructure of the Northridge Galleria wasn't built to sustain human lungs. It was designed to isolate them within a controlled retail circuit. Now that the circuit had failed, the cold was leaching out from the concrete foundation, drawing the heat from my joints until my fingers were too stiff to unlatch the utility boxes. A yellow light flared from the laundry terminal ahead. I dropped low behind a row of industrial linen bins, my iron pipe held flat against my forearm. This wasn't the green fluorescence of the tower or the crimson of my lamp. It was the greasy, orange glow of a fat tin candle. 3 men were crouched around an open floor drain near the commercial washers. They wore the gray uniforms of the mall's night maintenance crew, their frames skeletal from weeks of rationing. Their eyes were bloodshot, the lids twitching with the violent, irregular tremors of terminal insomnia. They hadn't joined the congregation on the concourse, but they weren't intact. The bunker clerk, the oldest one, Miller, muttered as he raised a rusted iron pry bar. He didn't look at my face. His gaze was fixed on the keys hanging from my belt loop. He's the one who's been keeping the logs. He knows why the elevators are cycling to the service deck. The cables are dead, Miller, I said, keeping my boots spread wide on the damp linoleum. The breaker pulled loose at 2. There's no current running to the hoist. You're lying, the younger technician, Crane, rasped. He was scraping a broken piece of slate against the side of a washer, his hand moving in a rapid, mechanical rhythm that didn't stop while he spoke. We heard the selector switches click from the vault. The 3rd car went up past the roof. It brought something down into the inventory suites. Dew locked the gate from below so we couldn't clear the pallets. They didn't rush me out of malice. They moved with the bureaucratic, desperate logic of men whose clocks were running down. Miller took 2 long strides forward, the iron pry bar lifted toward my shoulder, his boots skidding on the detergent slick that covered the floor. I didn't swing the pipe to kill. He shoved the lead edge of my inspection lamp straight into his chest, the heavy aluminum housing catching his collarbone with a dull thud. He stumbled backward into the linen bin, the metal frame collapsing over his legs with a loud rattle. Crane dropped his slate and lunged for my waist, his fingers clawing at the leather of my tool belt, his breath coming in short, dry gasps that smelled of stale salt pork and mold. "The distribution is wrong, Harlan," he screamed into my collar, his teeth clicking twice between the words. "The ledger doesn't balance. We have 40 cases of lard left, but the decimals won't line up on the sheet. Tell them to shut the speaker off." He wasn't fighting me. He was having a neurological seizure brought on by the 5 days of forced wakefulness. The alignment was creeping into his ears. 2 thin, perfectly straight lines of dark, iridescent fluid were trickling from his canals, running down his jawbone into his gray shirt. D managed to tear my jacket from his grip, backing down the delivery ramp toward the Anchor Store's deep storage vault. Behind me, the 3rd maintenance worker didn't move from the floor drain. He sat with his notebook on his knees, his pencil moving across the paper with a rapid, mechanical scratching, listing the numbers of every transformer terminal in the district. He wasn't looking at the page. His wide, unblinking eyes were fixed on the empty space 3 inches above his boots. I slammed the iron fire door shut, dropping the heavy locking bar into the sleeve. The impact sent a vibration through the concrete walls that was met by an immediate, massive response from the interior of the storage vault. The deep storage wing of the department store was a space the size of a hangar, filled with rows of double-tiered steel shelving that held unboxed winter clothing and display fixtures. The crimson light from my lamp didn't reach the ceiling joists, leaving the upper racks in a thick, charcoal obscurity. The floor was crowded. The unaligned hadn't left the department store during the migration. Hundreds of display figures, the fiberglass and plaster mannequins from all 40 retail outlets, had been dragged down the service elevators and arranged into dense, concentric rings around the central structural columns. They weren't stored in crates. They stood upright on their plastic pedestals, their artificial limbs bended into smiles and poses, their blank, featureless faces turned toward the ventilation ducts. Between them, the missing perimeter watchmen were standing. I found Marcus. He was positioned between 2 bridal forms, his canvas coat stiff with dried mud from the shipping docks. His eyes were wide open, his pupils gone, reflecting the dull red glare of my flashlight like wet slate. He stood with his hands extended toward the iron ductwork above, his fingers moving in slow, identical circles as if he were tracing patterns in the stagnant air. The structural drone inside my skull shifted into a lower registry, a deep, mechanical rumble that set a vibration through the metal racks. Above the columns, the ceiling tiles had been removed. The structural blueprints I had verified in the bunker showed nothing but dead space between the 3rd floor and the roof insulation. But as I raised my lamp, the light caught a massive, calcified tissue that had grown down through the iron support girders. It looked like a gray, pulsing lung constructed from copper conduits, roofing tar, and crushed ventilation tile, its surfaces expanding by inches every 5 seconds. The mall wasn't a shelter anymore. It was an incubator. The corporate architecture had been selected because its hollow, tiered layout functioned as a perfect acoustic receiver. From the center of the calcified lung, a sound broke through, not a voice, but the high-frequency ticking of an automated selector switch. The elevator car behind the drywall was cycling again, its iron weights dropping down the guide rails with a slow, unstoppable momentum that told me the platform was descending to our level to offload the next configuration. The weight of elevator car 3 did not drop with a swift cable snap. It descended with an intentional, unhurried deceleration that made the concrete walls of the shaft release a fine cloud of pulverized mortar. I held my breath, my lungs burning against the lack of air pressure in the deep storage vault. The scarlet lens of my inspection lamp cut a narrow path through the hanging dust, illuminating the iron track rails where the grease had frozen into rigid, yellow ridges. The motorized doors did not slide open smoothly. They buckled inward, the steel panels splitting down the center seam with a dry, screeching groan that deadened the permanent drone inside my skull. Inside the unlit car, 3 people were standing. They were the remaining members of the Galleria's governing council, including Director Hayes. They were not bound with ropes, and their clothes were immaculate, stripped of the grit that covered the rest of us. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their heels perfectly aligned on the rubber floor mat, their hands extended forward at chest height. They were holding a massive roll of structural blueprints. They did not blink as the scarlet light hit their faces. Their eyes were wide open, their pupils completely gone, replaced by a dense, velvety network of plum-colored threads that pulsed in unison with the movement of the building's infrastructure. The structural modifications are within the accepted margin, Harlan, Director Hayes's mouth said. The voice was clear, matching his exact administrative cadence from the winter meetings, but it lacked the small respiratory hitches of a living chest. It was an unpowered projection, emerging from his sternum like a radio signal bouncing off a flat plate. The third-tier allocation is complete. The decimals on the ledger have been balanced by the architecture. I backed away into the row of clothing racks, my fingers fumbling with the torn binding of the manual under my arm, the cold frontier survival in the Great Freeze. My knuckles felt stiff, the skin dry and peeling from the intense cold radiating from the open shaft. D didn't open the book. I knew what the logistics logs stated about the terminal phase of containment. When the administration stops hiding the blueprint, it means the population is no longer viewed as a variable. They are viewable as permanent fixtures. You signed the allocation, I rasped, my throat raw from the sulfur mist. Before the gates were even installed in May, Du knew the Galleria wasn't a shelter. The layout required a high volume of acoustic receivers. Harlan, the second council member, projected, her jaw dropping with a sharp, dry click. Corporate properties provide the necessary structural density. The grid cannot stabilize without an enclosed perimeter. Why are you still holding the tool? Without warning, the massive calcified lung tissue in the ceiling joists expanded. It dropped another 12 inches into the room, its gray, bark-like skin splitting open to expose thousands of copper wire bundles that wriggled toward the ventilation ducts like roots seeking a water line. D turned and broke into a stride down the primary shipping conduit, my work boot splashing through 3 inches of stagnant water that had pooled along the concrete floorboards. I did not look back at the elevator car, but the sound of the council's teeth clicking followed me into the dark, a rapid, synchronized ticking that matched the movement of my own pulse. The conduit was a long concrete tunnel that ran beneath the entire southern length of the mall, designed to let freight vehicles move stock between the anchor stores without entering the public concourses. It was an interior labyrinth of gray utility pipes, electrical conduits, and rusted steel support pillars. But the geometry was no longer straight. The walls were physically shifting. Under the immense pressure of the mass settling onto the roof 3 stories above, the concrete pillars were bowing outward, their surfaces cracking into geometric tiles that resembled the skin of a reptile. Every 10 seconds, a loud thud would reverberate through the floor as an upper beam flattened out, compressing the vertical volume of the tunnel by inches. The air grew so dense it felt like an opaque fluid, resisting my advance, forcing me to lean my entire torso forward just to clear the expansion joints. My 96 hours of sleep deprivation turned the obscurity ahead into a spinning field of gray lines. D swore. I could see my father standing near the secondary sump pump, his old logistics uniform clean, his hand holding open a logbook to show me a page covered in blank columns. "The shift is verified, Harlan." A voice breathed from a broken drainage valve near my ankle. It was an auditory hallucination, a projection of my own failing synapses translating the rush of water into my family's dialect. "The entry doors are welded shut from the outside. Sit down in the silt." I struck my own thigh with the iron shaft of my tool, using the sharp physical pain to clear the gray film from my retinas. The isolation was turning into a clinical poison, destroying my ability to separate the structural collapse of the building from the decay of my own mind. Ahead, the passage split into two tracking lines. The left branch led toward the main boiler room. The right branch dropped into the subterranean shipping docks, where the automated cargo doors faced the open highway. A line of pale, unmoving shapes blocked the right turn. The 300 sleepers from the main concourse had descended into the lower decks. They did not trudge or push through the narrow corridor. They stood in perfect rows of 10, their bodies filling the shipping conduit from wall to wall, their canvas coats bended together by the pressure of their collective presence. Their heads were all tilted toward the ceiling tiles, their unhinged jaws dropped so low the skin beneath their chins had turned a translucent purple. They were not shouting. They were launching a continuous, low-frequency drone from their chests, a flat, electronic whine that matched the rotation of the main generator before it failed. The sound shook the iron pipes until the scaling rust fell from the joints like red snow. I froze, my back pinned against a concrete pillar, my inspection lamp turned off to avoid the glare. In the gray twilight of the tunnel, I watched their hands. Every individual in the line had their arms raised 3 inches from their thighs, their fingers moving in slow, identical circles against the stone wall, tracing the path of the conduit lines. A child stood at the edge of the nearest row, the small boy who had been playing in the arcade hours earlier. His yellow sweater was torn at the shoulder, exposing gray, bloodless skin that had hardened under the sulfur fog. He didn't turn his eyes toward my position, but his jaw moved, his teeth striking each other twice clack-clack. "The technician is outside the grid line," the boy's throat projected. The voice was clear, resonant, and completely identical to Director Hayes' administrative tone. "D is carrying the inspection lamp. The ledger is near his belt." The entire column of sleepers shifted their weight. They did not lunge, they took one synchronized step forward, their boots hitting the wet concrete with a single deafening slap that set a high-pitched vibration inside my ears. The movement closed the gap by 3 feet, locking me between the reptile-skinned pillar and a wall of unbreathing flesh. I threw my weight to the left, lunging through a narrow ventilation hatch that led into the high-pressure steam lines. The iron edge of the frame caught my bad shoulder with a sharp crack, but I forced my legs through the opening, tumbling into the dry heat of the boiler room as the sleepers' column made another uniform advance behind me. The main boiler room was an iron cage that sat directly beneath the center of the Northridge Plaza. The 3 massive water tanks rose 20 feet into the rafters like black silos, their pressure gauges long since dead, their indicator needles pinned to the 0 pins. There were no sleepers here, but the environment was completely claimed. The calcified tissue from the upper tiers had poured down the central ventilation shafts like wet concrete setting in a mold. It covered the iron boilers in a thick, gray casing, filling the spaces between the valves and the pipe manifolds until the machinery looked like an ancient forest floor bended into stone. The pulsing expansion was faster down here, a 3-second loop that drew the remaining air from my chest, leaving me gasping for an atmosphere that was no longer there. I dragged my frame across the iron catwalk toward the final shipping dock gate at the rear of the facility. It was a massive steel rolling shutter, 16 feet wide, reinforced with industrial angle iron to protect the mall's inventory from highway raiders. I reached the control box. The manual chain hoist was locked with a heavy brass pin, the metal cold enough to skin my fingers through my cloth gloves. I threw my entire weight against the iron links, my boots skidding on the soot-covered grating as I strove to force the loop through the pulley block. The chain didn't move an inch. I raised my lamp to inspect the housing. The steel shutter had been welded into the concrete foundation. Long gray tendrils of the calcified lung tissue had grown down through the door frame, locking themselves into the iron slats until the rolling gate was no longer a moving barrier. It had been integrated into the load-bearing architecture of the terminal. The mall was fully sealed from within. The corporate layout had completed its transition, turning its defensive walls into a solid, unyielding tomb designed to contain the configuration until the arrival above the clouds was safe from the outside world. From the ventilation ducts behind my head, the unpowered intercom speakers clicked in unison. The 300 voices from the conduit were no longer calling my name. They had shifted into the structural language of the core, a low, rhythmic chant of stones grinding together in an empty riverbed. The field is sown, the perimeter is secure, the operator is logged. I collapsed against the welded shutter, my iron tool slipping from my numb fingers, landing on the catwalk with a dull clang that died instantly in the dense, unreactive air. Through the tiny fracture lines in the concrete wall beside me, the pale green fluorescence from the plaza was beginning to leak into the room, turning the gray soot on my boots a brilliant, glowing emerald as the ceiling began its final, 5-inch descent toward my head. The green light did not fade, it grew compact, a heavy liquid glare that pressed the remaining air down to the level of the iron floor plates. The concrete ceiling was now punches from the top of my skull, forcing me to lie flat on my side, my cheek pressed against the cold grid of the catwalk. The smell of burning rubber and old lime was stifling. My hands were loose, but the skin of my fingers had turned an inert, ash-colored gray from the absolute chill leaking through the welded shutter behind me. I could feel the structural rhythm of the Northridge Galleria changing gears. The high-frequency ticking of the elevator relays had stopped, replaced by a single, vast drone that originated from the central columns of the retail tiers. It was a massive, mechanical draw that felt as though it were pulling the bedrock itself up into the iron support frames. The audio came from the drainage channel beneath the catwalk. It was not a voice of flesh. It was the compression of the water pipes, translating the mechanical load of the settling upper levels into the exact, flat dialect of Director Hayes. The inventory is locked, Harlan. The iron pipe projected. The allocation has reached total balance. You cannot maintain an individual log outside the terminal loop. Log your hours. I kept my eyes open, staring at the green scales of light reflecting on the boiler casing. My 96 hours of zero sleep had passed into a permanent numbness. My memories of life, before the stasis, the smell of the grass outside the highway embankment, the sound of standard birds in the morning, had dissolved into an empty gray slate. There was nothing left inside my mind but the tracking sheets from the bunker, the rows and columns of figures that had organized the mall's final configuration. I dragged myself forward by inches, using my elbows to hook into the gaps of the iron grating. The ceiling tile had given way, dropping a layer of dry insulation onto my shoulders that felt as heavy as wet clay under the atmospheric pressure. Every movement was an immense calculation of muscular effort. The calcified tissue from the ceiling was now touching the boiler tanks. D watched the gray bark-like skin fuse with the iron plates, the root-like bundles of copper wire wrapping around the pressure valves with an automated intent. The structure was no longer a collection of retail shops and utility corridors. It had become a singular, integrated block of bone and metal, a solid terminal designed to ground the mass that was descending through the broken glass dome. Through a gap in the masonry wall, I could see into the lower loading dock. The 300 survivors from the concourse were no longer moving. They had been packed into the loading bays by the structural shifting of the interior walls, their bodies arranged in dense, vertical columns that filled the space from the concrete floor to the low ceiling. Their eyes were wide open, their sightless look fixed on the pulsing lung above the boilers. They were completely static, but their open mouths were functioning as a collective receiver, absorbing the green glare and translating it into a low, rhythmic chant that made the iron frames of the building shake. Harlan, the chant projected, 30,000 synapses firing in perfect synchronization through the dead intercom speakers. The ledger is closed. The perimeter is secure. Take your station at the line. My hand caught the edge of the auxiliary power link, the manual cutout box for the basement ventilation loops. The iron handle was locked into the on position by a rusted steel bolt. It was a useless connection. The generator had failed hours ago, leaving the lines dead, but the copper ground cable still ran straight from the casing into the deep bedrock beneath the sump pumps. If I pulled that handle, I wouldn't restore the lights. I wouldn't open the welded shutters or wake the people standing in the loading bays. The Galleria was dead. its architectural layout fully claimed by the blueprint of the arrival. But I would close the final ground circuit. I would route the entire electrical potential of the building's structural core straight into the earth, shorting the acoustic resonance that held the congregation in their mechanical dance. Without warning, a small figure slid through the ventilation hatch from the shipping conduit. It was the child from the arcade, his yellow sweater now covered in a layer of glossy black grease that didn't evaporate. He didn't trudge, he moved on his stomach, his limbs lifting with a calculated, mechanical precision that brought his face within 6 inches of my boots. His eyes were solid, velvet pools of plum black, reflecting the emerald glare of the boilers. His jaw dropped with a dry, mechanical snap clack-clack. The technician is an unmeasured variable. The boy's chest projected, the administrative tone of Director Hayes emerging from his small throat without breath. The line cannot complete its stroke while the manual hand is on the lever. Disconnect the node. He reached out his bloodless hand, his fingers moving to touch my ankle, to balance my electrical frequency with the core's signal. If his skin met mine, the alignment would complete itself in my brain, erasing the final column of my identity before the lever could drop. I didn't try to strike him. Day gathered the last remnants of my physical energy, my boots bracing against the concrete foundation wall as I threw my torso against the iron handle of the cutout box. The rusted steel bolt groaned under my weight, the metal screaming as the thread sheared. The drone inside my head rose to a blinding, deafening shriek, the entity recognizing the variance in its terminal layout, trying to force my eyelids to seal before the ground could close. My vision broke into spinning gray lines, my memory of my brother's face splintering into complete static. With a final, desperate crack of my bones, the lever slammed downward. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the quiet of a closed room, it was the total removal of all structural pulse. The green glare on the boiler tanks died instantly, the emerald light shrinking to a dull, ash-gray residue that left the basement in a heavy obscurity. Above me, the calcified lung tissue Java shuddered, its copper roots going limp, its gray skin cracking into 1,000 dry pieces that rained down onto the iron catwalk like gravel. The 300 voices in the loading dock went silent, their collective transmission cut at the root as the ground potential dropped to zero. They didn't fall or scream, they merely remained frozen in their columns, their open, sightless eyes fixed on the dark ceiling tiles, turned into permanent fixtures of an unpowered architecture. The stone sky did not rise, and the broken glass dome did not mend. The slate-gray mass remained fixed 12 feet above them all, a permanent ceiling that shut out the sky forever, leaving the region in a quiet, perpetual twilight. I lay against the cutout box, my hands ruined and covered in dried gray soot, but the permanent ringing in my ears had stopped. For the first time in 5 days, my head was completely quiet. D was the only node in the Northridge Galleria that hadn't been balanced. I was completely alone inside a flat, completed matrix that had no further instructions for a technician. I pulled my coat tight against my chest to counter the deep chill of the bedrock. A fine, breathless mist began to sift down through the broken skylight, the drops hitting the tin roof tiles with a soft, measured cadence that sounded like someone counting columns in an empty room. D closed my eyes, the long-delayed sleep finally coming down to claim my brain, certain that when my eyelids opened again, there would be nothing left to log but the permanent, unmoving gray of the stone above.